many years ago, I specialized in helping people develop keynote presentations and become better professional speakers. And I knew that was a very key part in me being able to help leaders, is that communication part. But I realized that so much of those communication skills weren't just for stage, they were for our everyday interactions. And you obviously, Dr. Rod, look, we communicate here on this podcast, and it kind of like appears like we're on a stage and we're on a platform, but this is not leadership. I mean, it's a very small part of leadership. It's how after this, I jump on a call with my team and manage them, and it's how I manage them, how I communicate tasks and everything like that. You've had a bit of a unique experience with communication as far as teaching. Obviously, as a university lecturer, how would you place the importance of communication, or your style of communication? How have you found you've been challenged in that? Obviously, people like badmouth lecturers, like, oh, he's a lecturer. How have you been challenged in that and adapted to improve your communication as a leader?
Well, I think one of the first things I learned was that I cannot expect everybody to be listening to me at any one point in time.
That's good.
And look, at university level, lectures usually timed around 50 minutes with a little break, and then you might be scheduled to teach a class for 2 hours or 3 hours. There's no way in this wide world that people are going to be able to listen to you for the whole of that time. So I kind of figure that at any particular point in time, about a third of my audience are not actually tuned in and listening to me. So as a communicator, I ensure that I repeat the important parts 2 or 3 times, but also that I communicate in slightly different ways. So in my field of economics, you may well communicate initially by explaining some theory, but you may be able to communicate the same ideas by reference to a practical example.
Yeah.
I think what we have to understand with communication, without actually giving a whole lecture on it, is that there's always a sender,
yes,
and there's a receiver.
That's really good.
And in the case of a classroom lecture or an online lecture, there are numerous receivers. Mm-hmm. And the intended meaning on the part of the sender sometimes gets quite scrambled.
Yes.
On the part of the receiver, because the receiver is actually going to filter that communication through their own experience, their own worldview, their own prejudices. So we can end up actually miscommunicating. And we need to bear that in mind, that somebody might receive our communication in a way that we didn't anticipate. But, we've really got to be open to that. And I think the other really important thing is communication is actually two-way. Mm-hmm. And lectures are not always a really good means of communication, because there is a tendency for the lecturer, in a sense, to take on the role of the expert and to assume that everybody in the audience is a sponge.
Yes.
And the sponge merely soaks up the wisdom that you share. So we've got to get away from that idea of communication. It is a two-way thing. And when we're in a one-on-one or a small group situation, it's always a good idea to say, well, what conclusion have we come to, or where are we at with this particular piece of information? Keep checking back with your audience to ensure that they've understood what you're communicating in the way that you intended, because it doesn't always end up that way.
That's really good. Yeah, because there's a sender, there's a receiver, but then there's a response. And that's where I think that a lot of leaders actually fall down, is they're really good at sending the instruction or the direction or the task or whatever, but they fail to make sure that they receive the correct response, to make sure that the receiver has actually received the right message. And as a lecturer, okay, you can't be. Obviously, the exams is when you kind of receive your response, to know if they're doing right. But even in that moment, remember, it's not always verbal. There's a lot of body language, like you were saying. About 30% aren't paying attention, and you'd probably know that because you were looking around the room and you saw body language that was showing that 30% of people were not actually paying attention. And so, yeah, I think that's key, is when we communicate as leaders, remember there's a sender, which is us sending information. There's a receiver that receives the information, but there's also then a response. And that response is how we as a leader gauge the fact that did I actually communicate this effectively? Because as Dr. Rod said, there's many levels of miscommunication, but there's also communication isn't just that's not the end of communication. Communication is continuous. Communication is continuous. You send, they receive, they respond, you receive, you respond, and it should just be secular. And there should be constant levels of communication. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube with Leadership podcast. If you've liked that, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any thoughts of how it challenged or helped your leadership, put a comment below. And we'd be honored if you would consider subscribing for more leadership content. Also, make sure you check out the playlist for more episodes like this.